So the first thing, if you haven't done it, or anyone that hasn't been to Montana, go to Butte. So Butte, Montana is is called the world's richest hill. There's massive copper deposits in Butte, Montana. I think I heard the statistics somewhere that at one point, 70% of the copper wire in the world came from Butte, Montana. So really kind of the settlement that really began here in Montana started with mining, and kind of the big settlements and the big urban center of the Montana for many, many years was Butte, Montana, because that's where that massive copper operation was. So how has Montana gotten burned? Well, let's think about that copper for a moment. Where has that wealth gone? So a lot of the folks that kind of ran these copper operations, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, and didn't live here. You know, they took the wealth and they left. So a lot of that money has left the state, you know, and gone elsewhere, and has not been invested here in Montana. Secondly, we've had to deal with the environmental legacy of that mining. So the other thing I'll tell you to go to Butte is go to the Berkeley Pit. The Berkeley Pit is a big, is the largest, basically ecological disaster site, Superfund site in the U.S. It is a pit of water that's full of heavy minerals that basically is increasingly moving up and threatening Butte's water table. And that was a result of the mining stopping in Butte and when they turned off the pumps. And, you know, wildlife occasionally land on the pit and die. And number one, no one's cleaned it up. It's threatening the water supply, and we have to deal with it. So there are these mines throughout Montana that are leaching, you know, toxic waste, you know, into our water. And the idea is that our wealth has been taken to good purpose in some other places, but we haven't benefited a tremendous amount from it. So Montana, I think, rightly feels burned. If you go back to the 1970s during the energy crisis, you know, people are wanting coal and wanting oil, and Montana has both those things. But then this idea that, well, there's regulations now coming in place saying you can't do X, Y, or Z to go get the coal or go get the oil. So that frustrates Montana. So this idea of, and the Anaconda Copper Company, which was essentially a one-horse town, basically ran the state of Montana for many, many, many years. They left mining in Butte because it was cheaper to do it in Chile in the 1970s. So basically Butte has struggled since, you know, to basically find, you know, people to find jobs and occupations and so on and so forth. So in many ways, I think Montana feels like stuck and kind of like a colony, right? The resources here go elsewhere. They have to. That's how we make a living. But at the same time, we're beholden to all these other resources, industries, companies, governments that kind of keep Montana going. 2012 in Montana, in that race, was about a guy, Jon Tester, who was what he calls himself a dirt farmer from Big Sandy, Montana, a town of like 700, way up north in Montana near Canada. And a lot of Republicans in the country basically said, all right, Tester's up for his first re-election. As we political scientists know, that's when the incumbent is incredibly vulnerable. So a lot of people said, you know, this is a good opportunity for Republicans to pick up a Senate seat and to flip the Senate to Republican control. So in thinking about that race, the congressman for the state at the time, the Republican congressman, Denny Rehberg thought this was an opportune moment to challenge Tester and win that race. The idea is that Rehberg was a proven vote getter. You know, he was winning, you know, about 60% of the vote, which is about what Republicans get on the presidential level. He'd been in politics for a long time. He had a widespread name recognition. He was able to raise money. He was personally wealthy. And just as critically important, I think, like Jon Tester, he's a native Montanan. Jon Tester is third-generation Montana. Denny Rehberg is, what, fifth-generation Montanan, and that's important. You got to have those credentials to run for office. Essentially, that race was pitting two well-regarded politicians who were good vote-getters against each other in that election, and Republicans had recruited probably the best candidate they had to run against Jon Tester. And as a result, I think most people here in Montana and a lot of folks nationally thought that Jon Tester was in trouble because Denny had been recruited. And so that basically is kind of the story here in Montana going into that election. About 80% of the money that the candidates raised came from outside the state of Montana. And that's both Rehberg and Tester. And that, in fact, actually, that's not unusual for Senate races in many states other than the largest states, California and New York, that can kind of self-fund. So, and a lot of that money is coming from California, a lot of that money is coming from Texas, from New York, Washington, D.C. So not only is Montana reliant upon the federal government and large corporations to come here and help us be able to live here, but we're also reliant on outside spending to run our Senate campaigns. That Senate election in 2012 was about a $50 to $60 million race. The second thing is about probably half, maybe more than half, of the money spent in the race, entire race, came from outside groups. So you have the candidates that are raising their money, and they're raising their money all under the auspices of the Federal Election Campaign Act, so it's transparent. You can go online, look up Tester, look at Rehberg, look at their donors, who's giving their money, you see all that. And the candidates control that money. They control that money, they control the message, they decide what they're going to talk about. But both Tester and Rehberg expressed to me at various points in the campaign frustration with the fact they had all these outside groups coming in and basically putting messages on television that were not helpful to them. So a lot of this money was spent on TV. You can imagine for a moment that if you flip on the television in Montana in 2012 or in the past election in 2018, you are inundated with campaign advertisements talking about the candidates. And a lot of that money is being spent by outside groups and outside interests who are, because of courtesy of the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, are raising money that is not easily traceable or transparent. And I think most people don't understand what Citizens United, what it really did is basically, before the Citizens United decision in 2010, corporate interests and labor groups could only basically spend money to influence elections through political action committees, which were all under the auspices of the Federal Election Commission. And those political action committees had very strict limits on who they could raise money from, how they could raise money. It had to be transparent, and the donations they could give. Well, basically, Citizens United comes in and basically says, well, these restrictions on corporate and labor spending are unconstitutional because it's a violation of political speech of these other entities, corporate or labor entities. But I don't think a lot of people don't appreciate what Citizens United did in the sense that we're not talking about the pipe fitters union. We're not necessarily talking about General Electric. We're talking about individuals who could set up kind of a corporate entity under the IRS tax code, raise a ton of money, or just put their own money into it themselves and come in and put in a bunch of television advertisements that in many respects look like a campaign advertisement that a candidate could fund. And they can make, and those advertisements tend to be almost universally negative and tend to be, how shall we say, play fast and loose with the facts. I don't want to say lie. They have a creative interpretation of the truth. Or they don't tell the whole story. So what happens is, and again, you also have individuals who don't have any particular connection to Montana other than that they want to basically have a Senate seat controlled by a Democrat or Republican, or they don't have any particular responsibility to this place that we live. And they don't have any particular responsibility to political discourse, right? They can come in, they can parachute in, drop a ton of money, and kind of say whatever they want, and who cares with the mess that's left behind, like the Berkeley pit in Butte. So in terms of developments here in Montana, at some ways, Montana politics hasn't changed at all. How has it not changed at all? We still have massive corporations who are trying to tell Montanans how to think, what to do, and to try to influence the outcomes of elections and legislation with a ton of money, and leaving us with the mess that's left behind, with the bad feelings, with all the negative ads, with all that other stuff. The silver lining, perhaps, in all of this is that all the spending in these competitive elections probably has had the effect of increasing voter turnout. and at least increasing the attention of these races on the radar screens of voters. So that's happened. But we're still, in many respects, still fighting with what it means to be Montana. Montana has always been in a situation where it has been captive of the fact that it is remote and hard to get stuff here and hard to get stuff out. We are captive when it comes to things like shipping. I think one of the greatest developments that Montana has is the internet and developing a more rural broadband and more access to the internet. Because what that does, it allows more and more people to work for themselves and to basically do jobs that could be done and get the pay of those jobs in San Francisco, Seattle, or Los Angeles, or Washington, or wherever, but be able to bring that money here. So I think one of the ways that Montana can become more independent politically, but also more independent in terms of economically, is through high-tech biomedical institutions that can come here, locate here, because people want to be here, that turn upside down this notion that we're captive shippers. The other thing is, with developments, I think, with things like 3D printing, I think it becomes a lot easier then to create manufacturing here in the state that doesn't require a lot of intense resources. So I think those things will help Montana become a little bit more independent. Frankly, if you look at our neighbors, particularly, let's say, Idaho and Utah and Colorado, our little bit more distant neighbors, they have become more distinctive largely because they have large urban areas. So one of the things Montana lacks is we don't have a Denver, we don't have a Boise, we don't have a Salt Lake City. And I think if we can develop a bit more of that kind of infrastructure here and diversify the economy, I think that also allows for a bit more independence as well. Montana, as a state, has both those elements that lean Republican, those elements that lean Democratic. And I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon.